For Monday, June 14th, 2021. We will be having all of our meetings on our YouTube channel. They will not be on KET, but on our YouTube channel. So if anyone is wishing to go back and watch any of the meeting recordings, feel free to do those on the channel. I do hereby call this first meeting to order. I would like to remind everyone who's in the audience, if you have a cell phone, if you would please just turn that to silent or to vibrate, it would be greatly appreciated. We do have a number of members that are going to be on remote location with us today. For those members, just a few observations. When the roll is called, if you would please indicate if you are in your home office or if you're in your district or in the annex, it would be greatly appreciated. And when you join the meeting, your microphones were automatically muted, so please remember to unmute your microphones before speaking. If you have a question or a comment during the meeting, please indicate that in the meeting's chat function. And once again, a link to the meeting materials was sent to members, and they are available on the task force page on the LRC website. Chris, if you would, please call the roll.
Senator Givens, Senator Thomas, Senator Wilson.
Here.
Representative Bonta.
Here in the room.
Representative Bojanowski.
Here in the room.
Representative Johnson.
Here in the room.
Senator Wise.
Present in the room.
Representative Tipton.
Here in the room.
Thank you very much. Our lead staff for the school funding task force to my left is Mr. Josh Collins, and our committee assistant to my right is Ms. Chris White. I want to thank them for the work they do. I know we always have a great staff with us, all of our LRC, and I want to thank also the other members of our education LRC staff that are also present and willing to contribute as well. I would like to recognize my co-chair, Co-Chair Tipton, if you'd like to say a few words, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. I was looking back as 1989, we had the Rose decision. It's been 32 years. A lot has happened since then. And it's always good to go back and examine and reflect on the product that we have. And this, I believe, is a unique opportunity for us to do that during this interim period. Not saying we're going to throw everything out, but let's just want to keep an open mind, encourage all the members to just keep an open mind. Let's listen, let's learn, let's ask questions, and hopefully there'll be good recommendations to come out of this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Tipton. I echo those words. Looking forward to this. I don't think there's any member on this task force that were present in the legislature when decisions were made about SEEK funding. So I look forward myself to getting into, I hate to say the wonkiness, but SEEK formula can be very wonky. We all know that. But I do look forward to the expertise we have on this task force. And I also want to recognize a number of invitees that we have participating and will be with us. I'm going to go over real quickly additional local level experts, so to say, that we will have and we've invited to participate in our discussions. This includes Devonna Page, the board member for Russellville Independent. She is also president of the Kentucky School Board Association. Ms. Brenda Jackson, board member of Shelby County. Mr. Tom Haggard, board member of Covington Independent. Paul Mullins, superintendent of Logan County. Robbie Fletcher, superintendent of Lawrence County. Mike Borchers, superintendent of Ludlow. And Chuck Truesdale, a designee or the commissioner of the education with Kentucky Department of Education. I want to welcome all those that will be participating as well, and happy for their participation as invitees. The first thing we're going to kick off with this morning is a preview of the Office of Education Accountability Report on school funding. In the meeting materials, it was included the scope of responsibilities of the task force, and these responsibilities include reviewing an upcoming report from the LRC's Office of Education Accountability due to be submitted in October. We've invited the OEA staff that's currently conducting that research to briefly share what kind of information we can expect to receive in that report. I know these members are presenting in front of us are no strangers to any type of education committee meeting. So if you please would introduce yourselves for the record, please, and the floor is yours.
My name is Dr. Bartley Gori, the Research Division Manager for the Office of Education Accountability. I'm here with the two lead researchers for the report.
Allison Stevens.
Sabrina Cummins.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. And Dr. Liguori, I think if you may take the lead on this, okay, please proceed.
I'm here to give a brief presentation today of the OEA and the SEEK report we are set to present later this year. OEA staff conducts research throughout the year and reports studies to the Education Assessment and Accountability Review Subcommittee, or EARS. EARS approved 3 studies this year, including the Support Education Excellence in Kentucky, or SEEK study for OEA's 2021 study agenda. We anticipate that presentation will be in October of 2021 or October 5th. This study will examine how SEEK and SEEK transportation funding is distributed to districts, issues of equitable funding between districts, regions, and rural versus urban areas will be considered, as well as local contributions that are made by districts. The study will also include how other states distribute education funding. After that report is presented to EARS, it will inform the work of this school funding task force. I'm now going to present or describe a preliminary outline of the study. The report will begin with an overview and description. The report will describe the funding allocation formulas, including SEEK guaranteed-based funding, add-ons for students who qualify for free school lunch or at-risk funding, exceptional children, students with limited English proficiency, and students receiving home and hospital services. We'll also discuss Tier 1 funding, Tier 2 funding, hold harmless funding, January growth, adjusted assessment, adjustments to appropriation, capital outlay, and transportation funding. OEA will not include a section on facilities funding in this report. OEA completed a report on facilities funding in October of 2020 if you want more information on that topic. After describing the current system, the report will provide an overview of education funding formulas in surrounding states, including base funding models, local share contributions, including property taxes levied by districts and other allowable taxes, funding for specific classifications of students, including students living in poverty, students with limited English proficiency, and students with special education needs, funding for districts that are small, isolated, and rural and remote districts, and also student transportation funding. Toward the end of the report, we may consider alterations to the SEEK funding formula and examine how the changes may impact equity. For each specific element change, any associated state cost increase will be offset in the 2020 SEEK guaranteed base, which was $4,000. Any increase or decreased cost to districts will be presented in any appendices that we include, and we'll compare the 2020 fiscal year equity gap between poor and wealthy districts before and after any SEEK alterations that we make. And thank you, and we look forward to informing the work of this task force. Was it? Very brief.
Perfect. Co-Chair Tipton.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. Dr. Gurriel, appreciate that presentation. And you mentioned some comments that have been on my mind as I've been thinking about this. We have seen a situation in the state of Kentucky where we have seen population shifts. And we're about to get our final census numbers soon, so we'll have a better idea from the current census. But these school districts in our east and the western parts of the state, more of the rural areas you referred to, we're seeing population shift away from those areas, resulting in lower property assessments. I'm a licensed real estate broker. I live in the Golden Triangle, and that seems to be the area where property assessments are going up. So as I understand it, you're going to be looking at that situation, and I would dare say that a lot of people think every district gets $4,000 per student. That's the number they get, and we're going to find out that they don't. So I'm assuming you are going to take an in-depth look at that and see if there are some adjustments that might need to be made in that regard.
Yes, sir.
Any other members, any other comments or questions? Seeing none. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. The next item on the agenda is kind of the meat and potatoes of today's meeting is the overview of SEEK with the and as we begin to inquire about the current school funding, we have asked for experts from the Kentucky Department of Education to provide kind of a high-level overview. Many times at Frankfort we call this the 30,000-foot view. It's maybe 100,000 foot. But we did invite with us today Ms. Robin Kinney, Associate Commissioner, the Office of Finance and Operations at KDE, and also Mr. Jay Ritter, Director and Division of District Support in the Office of Finance and Operations. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. Robin, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to give a very high overview of SEEK. In today's presentation, we are going to provide that high overview.
Robin, I'm going to ask you really quick to pull that microphone just a little bit closer to you if that's okay. Thank you.
just kicking it off to give you just a really high level. This is a slide that, my apologies for the small font. For me, it's a little difficult to read, but I think we're going to be focusing on C, which is about the third row down to the far right-hand side. You'll see a box that is entitled C. The rest of this chart is really to kind of help us put into context all the school funding or sources of funding and how they go from their origin of source through either the Department of Education or directly to their local school districts. And then I thought it might be helpful for the school funding tax. Really the larger context of most of the funds that go to our local school districts, but we are. Again, here's another depiction just to kind of put you in context. You'll see the state revenue for C on that second. We've included the amounts for fiscal year 2019 and 2020. And again, this is just a context slide for you. I'm going to switch microphones here really quick.
No problem.
See if this one is a little better.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the excellent staff support there. Okay, let's move right along. We're moving quickly because we want to get really to the methodology so you can see how it works. Co-Chair Tipton briefly talked about, where did SEEK come from and how long has it been around? So SEEK was first developed as a part of the Kentucky Education Reform Act back in 1989-90, and so it has been around for a long time. It was thoughtfully developed at that time, and we agree at the Department of Education that it's always good as circumstances and things change in your environment to kind of look back and see where you are and see if the components of any funding formula really fit the practicalities of today. So this has been around a while. There's been very minor changes really to SEEK since it was first introduced, and I'm sure Che will talk about that a little bit as we go through the methodology. Next slide. Additionally, just as background, there are some requirements for a local school district to even participate in SEEK in the first place. And so this slide kind of touches on those. Districts must employ and compensate all their teachers a minimum of 185 days. We have minimum student attendance days, 170 or 1062 hours of instructional time. And the compensation for all teachers must be on the basis of a single salary schedule. Currently, for this year, no non-resident pupils need to be in the average daily attendance unless subject to a non-resident agreement, or a child of a district employee can also be counted in AADA. In the last legislative session, of course, you passed House Bill 563, which would become effective in school year 2022, and that would change the calculation of ADA for non-resident students as based upon those non-resident policies that are adopted by each of our local school districts. So that's something that we'll see in the future changing a little bit. And then you'll see really the reflection of how long ago this has been. There is a minimum requirement that any secondary school which has a basketball team for the boys shall maintain the same program for the girls. So that kind of shows how far we've come, but it is still a minimum required. Next slide, please. As a refresher, for school years 1920, 2021, and 21-22, districts will resume taking attendance for funding. That is the base mechanics of counting students in the SEEK formula, and we'll start taking attendance again in this upcoming school year. However, Senate Bill 177, again, we've talked about that a lot in education environments. When the pandemic hit, it allowed us to count a little bit differently. It allowed school districts to choose their count for AADA based upon the 1819 or 1920 data, attendance data at that time. That was primarily due to the uncertainty of the pandemic, what was going to happen, and so the General Assembly really helped the department and local school districts back in the end of that first year as we were kind of trying to get our arms around what was happening, and then we kind of froze that for the next school year. So funding always looks backwards. So we have this that will calculate the funding for the upcoming school year. Then we'll start taking attendance, and that will actually affect the following school year. I'm now going to turn it over to Che. The rest of our presentation really is going to talk about during a normal year. So we're not going to reflect back on really what's happening with the COVID environment. We're just going to walk through the statutes and implications for a normal year because we're heading back in that direction as we start collecting attendance in the fall. So Che, I'm going to turn it over to Che, and he's going to walk us through a lot of the wonkiness, I think the chair said, about SEEK and how it applies.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Che Ritter with the Department of Education with the Division of Districts.
Che, also your microphone, if you don't care, please.
Is this a little better?
Perfect. That's
Okay.
it. Thank you.
I tend to be a little loud, so if I'm in your ear, let me know, please. So I'm going to walk you through, as Robin said and Senator Wise said, the wonkiness of SEEK. And as we're going through this, you have to imagine this is like formula. It's a calculation. But what feeds into this are a whole lot of huge chunks of data. We have some property assessments, to Representative Tipton's conversation earlier. You have student counts depending on the types of students. So this sort of snowballs into some pretty large dollar amounts for these districts, and we'll get into not super great detail, but I think deep enough to get a conversation started about this. But the very first thing we usually look at, and one you'll typically hear about in the media after the budget session, is, well, what's the per pupil amount? We get this call a lot right after budget. You'll see it, and the Courier will publish it, and other media outlets will say, well, the governor wants this per pupil, General Assembly wants this amount. So this kind of starts the conversation. Right now, the amount's set at $4,000. And we'll get into a little more detail on why that's not exactly the same number for every district. This is an important part of the formula. But this is always set in the budget bill. Of course, we've had 2 one-year budgets, so it was kind of set and then set again, which is kind of odd for us, those that work in the budget process. So right now, as we run the formula, we always just plug in $4,000. And I want to throw some terms out, and if we have forgotten to define them, let me know. But AADA is like an aggregate average daily attendance. So instead of just saying, I see 2 students, the schools are typically funded on this average daily attendance. And to give you a generic example, if a student is there 90% of the year, that would be a 0.9 ADA. So it's a very attendance-driven model, which becomes a very important part of the conversation a little bit later. So these are, as we get that per pupil number, that sort of starts the foundation of this. And then we have quite a few what we call add-ons, which are quite literally added on to that. So the first thing we do is look at free lunch students, which are called at-risk. This is 15% of that $4,000, so that's an additional $600 per free lunch student. This gets added into the formula for each district. And then you have exceptional child count. This is a pretty big number of students. You have the severe students, the moderate, and speech students. And if you'll notice, there's a kind of a weighting in the middle column there of 2.35 for severe. And this tries to recognize the additional cost to educate these students. And as you'll notice, this is a very big chunk of money, close to $500 million right now. So when we talk about SEEK, if we go back a couple slides, you'll notice that SEEK is, I think, a little bit over $2 billion. A good chunk of that is for exceptional children. Home hospital, not quite as many students, roughly 2,400. This number doesn't really fluctuate a whole lot, but it's $3,900, which is that 4,000 minus 100. And then finally, this was the latest thing as far as add-ons added to SEEK, was the limited English proficiency students. I think they were added, I want to say in 2006 or so, but this is about $384 per limited English student that a district has. And Chair-wise, we may have a question over here, I believe.
Representative Bojanowski.
I wasn't sure if we should ask just little questions as we go.
You know,
if
I'm
that's okay.
fine if we want to ask as it goes.
Just a
If
clarification.
that's fine.
Yeah. On the, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
On the free lunch, is it free lunch or free and reduced lunch?
Just free.
Okay.
Good
thank
question.
You.
Yes, just free. So And perhaps one day Representative Tipton and I can talk about real estate all day, because this is a fascinating topic when you're looking at SEEK. And I'm going to pick on some of his districts just to give you kind of a walkthrough, and we'll show you some examples of this. But local effort is a huge, huge factor in SEEK. This is like the big bear in SEEK when we run that formula. And if we travel back in time a little bit and we go to Shelby County, pretty sleepy community when I was growing up, Georgetown was as well. And over time you get some factories, those factories spin off other factories, and you get retail. So these counties tend to grow, and some at a very, very fast rate. Well, as that happens, the formula by its nature will actually reduce that per pupil amount. So, and it's what we just refer to as local effort. So as Shelby County's grown over the years, or Georgetown, or Scott County rather, that local effort will increase, meaning it's actually reduced from SEEK. Now, I'm going to pick on Spencer County, which is still a pretty rural community. It's got a nice lake, but there's a huge valley there, and I can't remember the name of the valley. I go blank, where the sod farm is. Every time I drive through there and think, one day a developer is going to build on that. One day, we may not be here. Well, that may change the entire look of Spencer County. They may drop a Hyundai plant in the middle of Spencer County. We never know. So these big changes can change a school district's funding very, very quickly. So as part of that is, for every $1 million that your property assessment increases in a community, that's about $3,000 in reductions in SEEK funding, roughly. And if you go to an independent district, and I'll pick on Superintendent Borchers over here at Ludlow, because their assessment, and they're in a smaller kind of mapped area, they can be a little more sensitive to these wild swings in assessments. So that's something that we pay pretty close attention to. Now, the Department of Revenue, along with the PVAs, work on certifying these assessments, and we get that data from the Department of Revenue about July, late July, basically, and that helps also determine local school district tax rates.
Chuck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Che, can you clarify, that's based on actual assessments, not what the district actually collects? So if they have a low collection rate, that doesn't affect?
Correct, yeah. So this is basically actual, collections is one thing. So the SEEK just looks at, it's a very generic 30 cents times assessment, basically. So for every $100, it's 30 cents of that goes toward local effort. Is that what your question, Chuck? Okay, thank you. I didn't know Chuck was going to be allowed to ask questions, but I'll watch him now.
Sometimes we laid him out of the basement.
So when we think of, and I'll spin off a little bit if I could for just a second to talk about local taxes, because that does tie into SEEK. So when you get your tax bill from your county, cities, and schools, schools are the only taxing entity that has this local effort. That's a really important part to think about, because if I go to Ludlow and look at their tax rate, I may say, gosh, Mike, that's a pretty high number. But the county and the cities, health departments, to my knowledge, all these other entities don't have that local effort, and that's part of that formula. It's been there for many, many years, probably since the beginning. So the other part of this, too, is as you look at your tax bill, 30 cents of that is that local effort. And on top of that, every district has to have this 5 cent for the facility support program in Kentucky. And you've probably heard some of you, and when Chuck was working here during budget, talk a lot about nickels. And these are just basically dedicated streams of funding for facilities. As simple as that. It's just part of their tax rate. Some districts have more than others, but the minimum they have to have is this facility support program of Kentucky called FSPK. And as the slide says, additional nickels do exist. Go ahead, sir.
Representative Johnson.
Yeah, excuse my denseness, but I'm going to back up for just a minute. Did I understand you say as property rates increase, what decreases? I mean, what,
SEEK funding, generically speaking, will actually decrease as
at the
property.
state level?
No, it's going to basically be about $3,000 for every million. So the idea behind SEEK is that as a community gains property wealth, and I do the air quotes there because there's some obviously debate on what exactly property wealth is. So they will generate more in local taxes. So a little less dependent upon the state. And I hate that terminology, dependency, but as a community grows, and I'll pick on Shelby County. 20 years ago, they were probably getting percentage-wise more from the state than they are now, simply because their assessment's grown, and just they've gotten, I don't know, 20 or 30 factories probably since, in 20 years, I'm not sure. But as that property value increases, they're getting less and less from the state, basically.
So the total amount stays the same. It's just a matter of where.
Right, and it shifts. Now, alternatively, if you're in a community where your property assessment actually decreases or stays pretty stagnant, decreases will cause an increase in that state funding. You're just not paying as much in local effort as you would as, say, Scott County or Shelby County, something
With the
like
goal
that.
being keep the same dollar amount.
Not exactly, but it stays roughly the same. So over time, and a lot depends too on actions of the General Assembly, like that per pupil amount. As you increase it over time, if we go back, I'm trying to remember, 3860 and 4,000. That's still a significant difference in the state budget bill. So as you all vote on that per pupil amount in the budget bill, any increase is obviously going to cost the state a little more money. And if it stays flat for 4, 5, 6 years, for example, the assessments are probably historically been increasing in most communities. So that starts to, kind of eat more and more into that local effort, take a little more local effort to make things work rather than state money. So,
All right, thank you.
yes, sir.
I
Okay,
think
we've got a couple of questions that are starting to develop. Robin, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Well, and if I can say back to Chuck's question about the property assessed value and how much is received, when we're talking about that calculation, of course, if districts are not, or if the community is not collecting all that they are entitled to, when we get back to Representative Johnson's question, keeping the dollars the same, they may not have the ability at the local district to keep those dollars the same because they're not collecting that amount that they are supposed to receive. So it doesn't necessarily keep all the dollars the same as that shift is made.
Perfect. Representative Bojanowski?
Just real quickly, the nickel tax, is that a one-time requirement or is there an annual requirement?
Annual.
Annual.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ritter, when you're talking about trying to keep it the same, that goes back to the legislation that created SEEK. That was the equalization portion of that. And that is the goal of it, is to make sure those in the rural districts are the less wealthy property districts are getting the same amount of funding for their education as those in the wealthy district aren't getting overfunded type of thing. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
From the state side of the formula, yes.
Okay.
Now, what they do locally, obviously, is the local boards of education adopt tax rates at the rate they feel is necessary to operate their district. But sure, on the state level, absolutely, you're correct on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Thomas?
Mr. Ritter, my question to you is the $3,000 decrease. Is that a flat $3,000 sum, or are we talking about $3,000 per pupil?
So it would be $3,000 per $1 million in assessed value. So, and to give you some context, and we'll show you an example of this, it may become clearer here in a few slides. I'll show you exactly what we're talking about with 2 actual districts.
Here's my question: Fayette County. Okay, if Fayette County gets a certain amount of SEEK formula, and just for an example, let's say they're getting $1 million. If Fayette County increases is probably assessment by $1 million in the next year, are they going to get $997,000 in next year, or is that $3,000 on a per pupil basis?
It would be the $997,000.
Okay,
in
so
your
$3,000.
example.
It's a
Right.
flat $3,000.
Right, and the idea too is as your assessment increases, so do your local taxes. So it's not a zero, of course, because they're going to get the additional tax dollars generated off that increased assessment. But and Fayette County is a great example of this as well.
Okay.
So
You've answered my question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Last question we got for right now, Co-Chair Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly for clarification, $1 of SEEK funding, what's that equivalent to in total dollars?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
I believe I had been told $1 in SEEK funding was equivalent to around $700,000. Is that close, or do you all know about that?
I'm not sure.
Chuck over here may know.
Chuck, please.
I think he's referencing a number that I've given them before.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Here we go.
Generally speaking, if the state wants to increase the SEEK per pupil by $1,
Got it.
so if you went from $4,000 to $4,001, it would cost the state treasury about $800,000, a little more. But I would say with the inclusion of full-day kindergarten, if that is permanent, that will increase that number going forward.
Good. Any other members? Mike?
Jay, could you talk a little bit about what happens when districts don't take the 4% compared to a district that does, as in how that would change the seat balance with keeping equalization? So for us, the last 10 years, we've always taken 4%. If another district over those same 10 years doesn't ever take the 4%, do they get more? They get more money from the equalization of seat compared to a district that would be generating more tax revenue?
So it's a little tricky in a vacuum for an example, but I'll try. So as a district or a board rather chooses not to take the 4% increase in their local tax rates, and it really, that decision does not impact SEEK. But what SEEK is doing behind the scenes is that formula will run regardless of what your board does, of course. So if they take the compensating rate, but they've lost students, for example, or some of your accounts are down or your property assessments just really increased, you could actually be running at a loss in state funding just naturally because it's a formula, and locally. Of course, in most districts, I would say, is their costs, just like anybody else's, do typically increase over time: insurance, utilities, salaries, et cetera. So that decision, which is made by 171 boards every year now, is a very important decision locally. Regardless, SEEK sort of treats everyone roughly the same. There's a few carve-outs for some special situations, but the local taxes is really a big decision that every local board has to make every year. And sometimes that 4%, like Superintendent Borchers has mentioned, if you're losing money on the state side because you've lost students or you don't have as many moderate exceptional children as you did the year before, that can create sort of a nice quick dip in your budget that you have to react to pretty quickly. And we'll get a little more into that, I think, when we get a little bit deeper into the slides as well.
Exactly. Thank you. Perfect. Please proceed.
Thank you. So this is what it looks like as far as local taxes are concerned. 30 cents, of course, every district from Jefferson to Science Hill gets that same local effort amount. 30 cents of these taxes basically get pushed back into the formula. 5 cents gets into that nickel conversation. So every time you get your tax bill, at least every district has that 5 cents on there, some more than others. There's Tier 1 funding, which, for lack of a better term, is sort of back in the day, I believe it was just kind of a carrot at the end of a stick. It's about $170 million in our state budget, roughly. But this is to keep districts' tax rates sort of at a reasonably set level, I think. When in the formula, it's like 15% of their SEEK calculation. It's kind of a bonus to them, if you will. It's a very important chunk of funding for most districts. I think there's 6 that don't qualify for it currently, just based on the and we'll talk about this a little more, the per pupil property assessed value. And then Tier 2 is similar to Tier 1. Now, there's not additional funding for this, but it's 30% instead of 15% of this base calculation. So as you're looking at local district taxes, which as you think about this, there's really, I think, for like two legs to this stool. State money, which comes through our state budget, of course, and this local money. And the locals, quite frankly, only have so many options to generate, and that's why it's very important, and I'm sure the two gentlemen to my right can attest to what a big decision that is every year, once a year. When these boards meet and they start, I'm sure, talking about it, probably right now in midsummer, that about July, August, they'll make this decision of adopting a tax rate, which can, quite frankly, change the trajectory of a budget very quickly for a district. So we're looking at these districts. They're all independent tax levying authorities. Every district will tax real estate, tangible property, which is basically your inventories and your office furniture and things like that, and then motor vehicles. And anytime you get your property tax bill or your birthday card from your county clerk, you'll see that on there. But some may also tax what we call the utility tax, which is utility gross receipts, up to 3%. And if you'll see down the chart below, not all districts levy that. Most do, but not all. They may also do occupational tax. Similar to the cities, the city of Frankfort does it, but what's a little different about the schools is that they can only tax those who live and work inside that community. So, for example, if Campbellsville decided to do this, Campbellsville Independent, it could only be those folks who work and live inside of that community. There's also an excise tax, which no districts currently levy. This one's on your personal tax liability, so not quite as popular. And very rarely have we even gotten a question on that one. I just don't think it'd be very popular. And then aircraft and watercraft, they can actually adopt a tax on these two things. Now, the watercraft, your neighbor's pontoon is already taxed through the clerk's office, but this watercraft actually refers to some larger boats that are typically on your rivers and things like that. So this is what SEEK looks like when we lay it out. And this is Anderson County. And for no particular reason, we just wanted to grab one of the counties that was near us, just because it would show you what goes in. Your upper left box is what we call the inputs. This is basically the ingredients that will get us to this formula momentarily. Below that, you'll see Anderson County is actually this is where their nickels are. And they've got their local facility support program with Kentucky Nickel. You'll see a local and state amount. Now, that state amount's the equalization. And one of the huge reasons that Anderson County did back in the day, they did an additional nickel, that original growth, is that to the right, you'll see an amount for $540,000 and another amount for $675,000. Those amounts are actually included in the state budget. And this is basically a state, and I hate this word, it's not a match because it's not dollar for dollar, but it is equalization. Very important part of this process is the state equalization for facilities nickels. And we could do a 16-hour class on nickels. They're confusing, and they give everybody migraines, but Senator Wise is saying no. I'll bring that back next time. But I want to point out, because this is something that in the past couple sessions, the General Assembly has addressed. Every session we have to address nickels. And when Chuck was in your all's employ, Chuck and I would sit around and talk about nickels, and I'm sure the paint was even bored listening to that. But it's very, very important to the districts. It's a conversation we have with districts. If they have facility needs, this is how they pay for it, basically. In the middle is just the calculation. And you'll see the per pupil column, don't pay a lot of attention to that because it's a little misleading. This just takes the total and divides it by this aggregate average daily attendance. But one thing you'll notice is a local effort amount. To Senator Thomas's question earlier, for Anderson County, they generate $13 million in base money, which is 4,000 times the aggregate average daily attendance of about 3,300 students. Their free lunch kids generate some money. The home hospital students, not very many of them. Exceptional child counts, about 2.1 million for Anderson County. Transportation, which again is a pretty complex formula, and we'll get into that a little bit. That's almost $1 million. And then limited English students, about $12,000 and change there. So we've got a base funding amount of $17.3 million, which sounds pretty good. But there's always a but when we talk to districts. Your local effort for Anderson County is about $5.8 million. And this is that 30 cents per $100 of assessed value. And that assessed value is in the far left upper corner of that paper, $1.9 billion. Now, we're in a nice real estate boom right now. And typically, over time, and during the budget process early on, we start working with Greg Harkenrider, Michael Jones, and their staff talking about property assessments, what we believe they're going to do. And just at an uneducated guess, I'd say they're still pretty hot everywhere and moving quite briskly. So we're going to probably see, come soon, when we start getting property assessment data from the Department of Revenue, Anderson County's number is probably going to jump quite a bit. And this causes that local effort, $5.8 million, all of a sudden it might be $6.2 million. And if they're students and everything stays exactly the same, they just went negative from the year before. So that's that property assessment. Now, locally, they'll be able to tax that additional assessment. And going back to Spencer County, if I build a new neighborhood in this beautiful valley in Spencer County, it was a sod farm, now it's neighborhood. That new property will generate a lot of money because it's gone from basically agriculture to, say, residential or commercial property, for example. So that generates an additional jump in their assessment and can create a lot of new revenue for Spencer County. So we do like growth, but we don't like super fast growth because it causes just a uptick really quickly, and that can be a little dangerous. For some smaller districts, it's very hard to sort of manage through a budget when your local effort shoots up like that. So we'll continue on just through the formula real quickly. There's some adjustments that we do. In some cases, prior year adjustments, if we mess something up the year before for Anderson County, we'll take care of it in the following year usually. But then you have your Tier 1 funding for Anderson. It's almost $1 million, $965,000. So it's a pretty good chunk of change for Anderson County. And you'll see a lot of zeros in here because this is an early run. So when you think of SEEK, we run it 3 times a year. We do a forecast, which is probably, let's say 40 to 50% actual numbers. The rest are estimates from the districts usually. And then we go in the late fall or early fall, we'll firm that up and get some actual data from the prior year and plug it in there. And so that's a pretty good indicator of what their funding will look like. And then we get to final SEEK, which is always in March of the following year. And that's all final data. And I'm going to grab it all from Superintendent Borchers and Superintendent Fletcher's systems. And we're going to say, okay, here's your final amount of funding. So throughout the year, they're going to see some fluctuations in funding because of this. So if they use an estimate that's pretty close, they'll be fine. If not, or if they've got a lot more students than they expected or a lot less, it creates that up and down motion of their budget and local money and state money. So all combined, it can be a little bumpy at times.
And the slides we have here today are forecast slides for the upcoming school year. And for any of the districts, this is all available publicly on our website. So you can go out and actually look at your particular districts so you can see exactly what their sheet looks like.
So if you'll look at local effort again, the $5.8 million number, to the left of that, you'll see for Anderson County, that's roughly $1,772 per aggregate average daily attendance. Let's just keep it simple and call it per student. So then I'm going to go to Wolfe County. We wanted to find one that's sort of on the other end of the state, but also that shows this difference. You go to that same spot on their SEEK page, different community, different property, different boundaries. Instead of the $1,700, it's $704 per student, roughly. So there's a significant difference when you go from Anderson and Wolfe County in the amount of local effort, if you will, even on a per student basis. Where Anderson's paying well over $5 million in local effort, Wolfe's is $816,000. Now, I'm going to jump back to Anderson real quickly. So if you go to the upper left again, where it's $1.9 billion, right beneath that is per pupil assessment. If you had to tell me, Che, what are your 3 favorite numbers in SEEK, this would probably be number 1 or number 2, because this determines what a lot of districts should be paying attention to. But that per pupil assessment will determine equalization levels, Tier 1 funding, and it also tells you a lot about the community. So Anderson County, for every student, it's about $590,000 per student of their assessment. Wolfe, $234,000, roughly half, give or take. If you go to Anchorage, it's well over $1 million. If you go to any community, and like Robin said, these are all on our web pages, this is all public information, you can see a pattern of, maybe your districts, where you live, where you drive through. There's some huge differences between these communities. Scott County is going to be pretty high because of Toyota and all the development there. But if you go to a more rural community, agriculture just does not grow in value as quickly as a factory would, of course. So there's a difference there. And again, that drives a lot of this formula. But it also tells us a story of when we talk about, I think Senator Wilson mentioned that, money's being pushed from the state to a district that has less property wealth. This is what helps determine that. So a very important number. So this is just a generic example of, 2 students in different districts, because we kind of wanted to show, of course, behind all these numbers, these are students, literally. That's a huge part of this formula. So for every student, if you put one in District A and one in District B, and we created that same type of generic student, if you will, we start out with that 4,000. And then because I'm a bad person, I have to reduce local effort, as the districts will tell you. So less 30-cent local effort. District A, it's just a bit over $1,000 we're reducing, but District B has got a higher property assessment. So it's a lot more. So we start out with a subtotal, and you can already see District A is sort of ahead the pack here. But we go to free lunch, same for both districts, $600. District A is going to get some Tier 1 money, just part of the formula again. But if you notice, there's a big difference in local taxes. So District B, over time, as their boards, multiple boards over years, I'm sure have decided we want to levy a higher rate of taxes so we can have additional money for certain programs that we want locally. This is what we get from SEEK. And District A, because they get a little more from SEEK, they may have determined we don't need to generate as much locally to do what we want to do in our community with our schools. So this difference is, and that's that board autonomy to decide what we want to do with our tax rates. So District B, about $9,155, and District A, $6,200. Pretty significant difference. But this is not two particular districts. We just want to show an example of how this can work with two generic students. So there's a lot that goes into this formula, and I'm not going to go through each of these in great detail unless we need to, and we can always talk about some of the finer points of these, but property assessments we've talked about, per pupil property assessments, transportation, all these things that you see on this gives you an idea of how much goes in. And to get us these dollar amounts that will, eventually my office will cut a check and send out to districts. And we'll go through quite a few of these. Again, property assessments, this gets into that local effort. Oh, we have a question. Sure.
Co-Chair Tipton, thank you.
Sorry.
We're going to see huge increases in assessments in a lot of our communities. I have a lot of constituents who think I can control their assessed value on their property who have gotten updated assessments this year. I'll explain to them how to do the appeal process. But in areas that are growing, I mean, we're talking huge increases. Mm-hmm. So as those assessed value grows, their local effort is going to grow as well. But assessed value does not necessarily equate to revenue comes in because of the rate they actually choose to levy in that district. Is it conceivable that a district with high growth and assessment could even increase the max amount of 4% and still come out with less money from the state? I mean, can you dig into that rate? You understand the complexity of the ratio I'm trying to get at there, because you've got the total property value and the rate that they levy. If they just take the compensating rate and they've got a huge increase in local assessment, they're not necessarily going to be bringing in as many dollars. Am I correct in that assessment?
Right. I don't think it's dollar for dollar. And it's been some years ago, I can't recall, and Chuck may have a better memory than I, on the 4% adjusted assessment. There's an adjustment we do when real estate in a community grows faster than 4%. The General Assembly passed some language, and we do sort of a sub-calculation. And I'll tell you, for a couple of years, you'd see one or two districts get this adjustment. Now it's going to be a lot more frequent. That does claw back some of that local effort, which is a great thing for districts, simply because, if Superintendent Borcher's district grows fast, that local effort is kind of a runaway horse after a while, and that clawback does give some of that money back to the school district. Now, I still don't think it's a dollar for a dollar, and what you collect in local taxes, obviously, and there's some other factors like if there's an increased assessment at the local Walmart, but they petition the PVA and say, we don't agree with this assessment, and it takes a while to hash that out and work it out. I'm not trying to pick on the PVA. It's just part of that. It's a natural part of that process. Mm-hmm. So the district may have gotten the assessment up here and expecting $10 million, but by the time it's all done, they may get, $9.5 million. And that's a significant difference. But that's just the process. I don't know of a way I wouldn't say it's broken or it needs fixing. It's just the process. So a smaller district, if they have one big employer in their community and that employer petitions and says, hey, or rather protests, that assessment, that can put a real pinch on some of these smaller districts. But even the mid-size and somewhat larger districts, and you'll see it in the paper every once in a while, that a large employer in the local community is, petitioning or protesting rather, their assessments, or that the local district has a lot less revenue because of an adjustment made. So,
please proceed.
Another question comes to mind. We have a lot of our communities in the state that a large percentage of their property in that community is government owned. Mm-hmm. And not subject. Could you explain the impact
Sure.
it has on that community where those property values are not calculated in?
See, I knew he and I would just get along great during this. So when you look at, and I'm going to pick on Franklin County since I grew up here, and not that we're in a government building, but a lot of property in Frankfort is exempt because the government owns it. So when you look at the universe of property, you're going to have quite a few exemptions for religious, obviously. Post-secondary ed has some exemptions. Kentucky State right up the hill. You're going to have government-owned city, state, county. You also have in some communities, I'm going to say Muhlenberg County has a pretty good size wildlife area, which is managed by Fish and Wildlife. So the Department of Revenue by county, not by school district, and I get this from them about once a year. It's rather interesting read to see how much exempt property exists in each county. Obviously, Franklin County's got quite a bit, and Frankfort Independent, which is right where we sit today, a lot of their property, it's mostly residential in downtown, but quite a bit of that property is exempt from taxation, which is not included in their property assessment. And I know Superintendent Barber from Frankfort Independent's been here before to talk about that. But even something like Fort Knox, Daniel Boone National Forest, and if I remember correctly, we had a hearing here years ago, and Rowan County was here to talk about Daniel Boone. Chuck might remember this better than I do. The hospital and something Moorhead University. So those are three pretty big things in Rowan County that are just tax exempt. I'm not trying to pick on Moorhead or any of those guys, but so when you look at that picture, you'll see in some communities that exempt property is just like kind of a non-player in this game. It doesn't generate anything for the district. Now, I'm not sure the extent how deep the details go with the Department of Revenue, but if that's something the committee would like to kind of see for your own, I think it's an interesting look to see what in each community.
Good idea. Senator Thomas.
Jay, I'm going to take the position in this task force that there's no such thing as a stupid question. So in looking at your assessment, I'm going to take Wolfe County here.
Mm-hmm.
The assessment is $272,022,474. Are you dividing that assessment by the AADA in order to come up with the per pupil assessment?
Yes.
Okay.
That's not a stupid question either. That's a great question. Okay. Yes, that's exactly how we're doing it.
Okay. And then my next question, and this gets more into the complexities of what Senator Tipton was talking about. What do you do on these tax exempt properties like bases? Because I was thinking about Army bases when you talk about tax exempt, and people live on those bases. I mean, are they getting a free ride? And maybe that's a strong term politically, but are they getting a free ride in terms of that their home not being assessed, and yet their children are going to school?
It depends on where, but we'll just pick on Fort Knox. If there's folks living on that, and I know Fort Knox, I believe, has their own schools.
Yeah, Fort Knox
has
has their own school.
But if, for example, and I think too, we have to consider the amount of economic impact that some of these tax exempt entities generate in a community, and that's a sort of a strange balance. And I'm going to pick on a hospital. Doctors that work there, nurses, the jobs it creates. They may also have occupational tax, which generates a lot of money for the school district. And I know that there's also industrial revenue bonds, which may exempt a factory that comes into your community, and it may be for 20 years. Those are pretty complicated, and those will have an impact in your community. But I think as well is that each community has to balance, we want these jobs, of course. That's a big deal in every community. So how do you do that? You don't want to obviously give away everything, but you also are competing against other states, other towns, other communities. It's hyper competitive, really, and other countries. I mean, if we really get down to it. So I have a hard time saying free ride because I think everyone's participating to some degree, but I do think that gap, and we can't force Fort Knox to start paying property taxes. Hardin County would love me if I could do that, but it does create, that question of are they paying into that community? I would say sales taxes come to the state, which helps support SEEK. There's a lot of things they do outside of Fort Knox, which do help that community in E-Town and, of course, Hardin County. So,
thank you.
Yes, sir.
Jay, joining us online on the chat function is Devonna Page. Ms. Page, if you're present online, if you could hit unmute and please proceed with your comment or question.
Thank you, Senator Wise. I just wanted to point out, and perhaps Mr. Ritter could expound on this, is that the permissive taxes are recallable when a district first imposes them. And also, as far as property assessments go, accuracy as to those assessments are very important. And those assessments are done at the local level by each individual PVA.
Sure, really can't stress how important the PVAs are to this process. Of course, they are quite literally the boots on the ground that determine a lot of this property assessment. And the Department of Revenue does their part of that. But one thing we tell all of our school district finance officers and superintendents is to pay very close attention to the PVA, because they can obviously tell you, like right now, I'm sure the Spencer PVA and Anderson and Shelby are saying the same thing. We're expecting a very large increase in property assessments, which will, for planning purposes, becomes very important to these boards. Let me jump back. So if we go back to these taxes, go ahead, Rob.
Che, I also say those same conversations with PVAs in certain areas that are less fortunate to get that increase in property taxes are happening as well, showing that their property, again, as people migrate out of certain areas, and you really have got the tale of two cities. You've got some that are going to get a big boom. And I think the other thing to point out is we don't really know how long that's going to last. Is this a market reaction to the pent up real estate market? And I defer to Representative Tipton on this as the expert in this area. But, and districts and our process doesn't react very quickly. So we are looking a year backwards all the time. And so you wonder what's really going to happen with the real estate market, whether this is a blip on the screen or if these values are really going to hold true and it becomes our new norm. So that's another challenge to all this discussion about the real estate part of it.
And to Mrs. Page's point about some of these taxes, the 14 districts that have not levied this utilities gross receipts tax, the 163 that have not done occupational, if their boards chose to go down that road to try to levy these, they do run into the potential to be these taxes to be recalled through petition. The local community can petition it and force a vote, and this can creates obviously some heartburn in a community. If a district, I know of a handful, it's been quite a while since anyone's talked about doing a new utility tax, but the ones that have, almost immediately ran into, this isn't going to, our public's really not supporting it right this minute. So, and boards are obviously elected officials, so that's who they're answering to. That's just the process. So,
Che, while I've got you, I'd like to ask a question. In terms of my district, you're getting into the heart of a lot of tourism down there with Lake Cumberland, Dale Hollow, Green River Lake. And I think there was an article maybe the Herald Leader did a few years ago about watercrafts and taxing. In terms of that, have we seen that play itself out over the years, or has that been? I know it gets very touchy because we have a number of lobbyists represent a number of associations get into this, and then once again the tax issue. But can you talk to me about, has there been any concerted effort that's been made by the legislature to do anything with watercraft, or has that kind of been left up to local decision?
I think it's been left up to local. I would probably defer to the Department of Revenue on if it's been impacted by any changes in the way they're registering watercraft and things like that. We're not that deep into the assessed values of these boats. We just aren't. We kind of always defer that over to the Department of Revenue. But we can get some more information on that if you'd like.
Thank you. Co-Chair Tipton.
Chairman Wise, I can add a little bit to this conversation. Representative Carney had legislation a few years ago. I've carried that the last two sessions. And what you get into, if these large watercraft, they can sign up to with the Coast Guard to be a registered vehicle with the Coast Guard, watercraft with the Coast Guard. In that situation, I think it exempts them from taxation at the local level, and a lot of these are. They're still required to pay tangible, but however, the collection method has not been there. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of pushback from some folks on the other side of that industry, and I am, time permitting, supposed to have some conversations this summer, see if we can work something out on that. Perfect. Because it is a big impact on those school boards that live in those communities with lakes. It is a significant dollar amount.
Thank you, Co-Chair.
So we talked about property assessments, and again, per pupil property assessment is just that assessment divided by the AADA, or roughly the student count. And again, that helps determine, it's a big factor, it helps determine equalization of their facilities nickels and Tier 1 funding. So transportation is a humongous formula and very complex. I know that over the years, every year we calculate it, it's one of the probably most stressful periods because we're usually running out of time. We've got a March 1 deadline. But I'll go over some of the high points with you. It's only to and from school. That's just part of that. And we don't do field trips. That comes out of the district bucket, if you will. There is a depreciation formula. So when they buy buses, there's, I think going way back, some incentive for them obviously to maintain these over a 14-year period. And it's 124% of the purchase price, which sounds like a wonderful deal. But transportation is not fully funded, so it's not quite 124%. We're currently about 55% funded in transportation. So what that means is I need, $389 million to fully fill up that bucket for the districts. And right now I've got about $214 million. Now this is not new. It's been this way for at least 10 years, if not longer. Now we'll talk a little bit about, has the General Assembly ever dumped more money into that bucket? Absolutely they have. So that goes a long way with these districts as well. And, districts provide quite a bit of transportation in this state. I think we have a very small number of districts that do not provide transportation. And those are very, smallish community schools, if you will. So there's additional funding for transporting deaf and vision impaired students to Danville or Louisville. And vocational transportation is also part of it. It's a small bucket, but it does help. So when we're talking about tax rates, which is this other side of the coin, it's hard to kind of measure what different communities and how they tax and what that actually means. And I'm going to pick on Senator Wise's districts, Taylor County and Campbellsville. Two very different school districts. Taylor County is obviously a lot larger than Campbellsville. Campbellsville's got, the same issues that many independents have. They're landlocked. It's not like they can steal land from Taylor County to tax. I don't think Taylor County would be happy with that. But if I'm moving into a community and I want to know, what do I pay in taxes here roughly? This levied equivalent rate is what we kind of call the kitchen sink rate. When you look at this rate, and this is available online, you can use it as sort of a comparative tool. And I want to look at Jefferson and Anchorage. Where would it cost me more to live in school taxes anyway? Or Shelby County and Spencer. And what you'll see is there's some pretty significant differences between county districts and independents. And because the independents usually have a lot less land and property to tax, their tax rates are typically going to be a little higher. There are a few exceptions to that. But some counties as well have a very aggressive tax policy, and their boards have had that for many years. And anytime you see in the paper about, and you'll usually see it about August, they start talking about the school boards and what they're thinking, what they want to do. And that goes right into this levied equivalent tax rate. But it also factors in all those other kind of odds and ends like utility tax, occupational tax, if they have it, if they don't. But I think it's a good resource just to kind of give you some context of what, in your community, what each school district actually kind of what level they tax at. So SEEK looks behind in the prior year, in a normal year. We would always look behind to grab the data. We let the districts, clean it up, get it ready for us, and we basically grab it and say, okay, here's your student count, here's your ADA, and we're going to pull that in. But there's also to factor in districts that grow in the current year. Come fall, we'll do a snapshot. It's been in place for many years, and we used to have a lot of growth in this state. And that's slowed down quite a bit due to economic factors and many other things. But it allows districts that if you gained 3, 4, 5% more kids, you might need to hire additional staff. So this growth calculation is sort of to help offset that cost of hiring additional teachers or instructional aides or whatever you need in that current year. So free lunch students, again, we use an average daily membership, which is a little bit different. And if we want to get into enrollment versus membership versus ADA, we can. We'll bring some other slides over, but it gets a little deep into the weeds. But again, this is about $600 per student. And another thing, if you do go out and look at that one-page SEEK that we showed you earlier, sorry to hop back, you can see their at-risk count is right here. In Wolfe County, it's 992 out of about, let's call it 1160 ADA. That's a high percentage of free lunch students. And if you go to Anderson, 1558 out of about roughly 3,300 students. Not quite as high, but still that's a lot of free lunch students. So when we go talk about $600 per student, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up very quickly when you go across the state. Oh, we have a question. I believe.
Representative Bojanowski.
Yeah, just a quick clarification. So that 15% times 4,000, will that be at the SEEK level, or will it be adjusted if the state's?
I'll show you exactly where we do that. It's right up here. And for Anderson, it's that sorry, my cursor's a little, 935, and then we'll take that local effort out.
Okay.
After. So it's all kind of bubbled up at the top, and then we'll reduce that local effort.
But when you compute the additional that you get, say for free lunch students, is it 15% times 4,000 for every district?
Yes. Yeah.
That was my
Same
question.
rule applies, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Thomas.
Yes, Jay, I'm going back to what you said at the beginning. The at-risk or free lunch program is for our add-ons. So then you take your SEEK formula. Let me make sure I at least elementary now, because I'm learning as we go. You take your SEEK formula, you do your add-ons, and then you subtract your local effort.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So when we talked earlier about, I'm sorry. My
Superintendent
apologies.
Fletcher. No problem.
Just one comment. We've talked a little bit about collection rates and how important that is for local districts. One other thing to keep in mind too, it's also important to realize we have to get the information from our students, from our parents on how many at-risk students we have. So sometimes districts may have paperwork on 60% of the kids, but there may be 75% of the students that are free lunch. So that's also dependent on the information you get back also.
Great point. Thank you, Superintendent Fletcher. So a large part, as we showed you earlier on the slide, almost $500 million are for the exceptional children, and there's different categories. And this is just a breakdown. So you'll see high incidence. It's just the frequency, like speech, the disorders of speech. I was one of these kids back in the day, and you have moderate and low incidence. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but it gives you an idea of how these are broken out into categories, and there's different weights for each category. So these are the weights, and this is, for speech students, it generates about almost an additional $1,000, but it's $960 or so. And if you notice, the weight 0.24 times 4,000. So let's say the General Assembly changes that in the next budget to $4,050. That factor remains the same unless you all change it. So it goes up along with that per pupil amount as well. The moderate students 1.17 and the severe 2.35. So that's 4,680 and then 9,400 per student. And for a lot of districts, I'd like to defer to my colleagues over here to my right about, this generates a lot of money for districts, but there's also, I think, a lot of associated costs with educating these students as well. And this is something that we have a lot of conversations with the program areas that track these students, and we try to look at trends. That's a big thing to us, is understanding our population. And one thing we've noticed in the last couple of years is, as a state, we've lost students, but we're gaining in exceptional children. As a matter of fact, I remember calling Ludlow Independent and asking them, what can you tell me? And some districts have said, various reasons that we see these counts. They're identifying students more and more and things like that. So as our population changes, birth rates, there's all kinds of things that can factor into this, but the types of students you have, and it will vary going next door to Dayton or Newport. It will vary wherever you go. So it's a very important part, I think, of this process.
Representative Bojanowski.
Yes, thank you. Just real quickly, so the federal government, are they supposed to fund 100% of the exceptional child? What I understand is the federal government isn't funding all of special ed costs.
That I can't speak to. Because I don't deal with federal money, but we can look into that and see to what extent they do fund it. And I'm going to pick on my friends over here and ask them, do you all have any idea of what you get from the feds on special education?
I know the number, but it still doesn't. There's the maintenance of fiscal effort also. Right. We're required by law, once we receive federal dollars, to match it with local dollars so that it's not a supplant program. So regardless of what the federal government supports with that program, we have to also offset it with local dollars.
Yeah.
And Che, could I real quick?
Please,
could you also explain, when we talk these December 1st counts, for a small district or even a large district, if you get a large influx of kids after December 1st, you're basically educating and using all your local funds for almost a full year and a half before that money kicks back in?
Yeah, so the December 1st, as I said a minute ago, kind of lied to you all and said, well, we look behind us. It's always end of year data, come June 30th, but this is the kind of odd duck that's December 1st. I can't recall if that's a federal, I can't remember why it is December 1st, but he's correct. As you take a snapshot of Ludlow, if a kid comes in December 2nd, they don't get that funding for a long time. A year is a long time to wait, especially if you've got, say, 5 or 6 that come in, halfway through the year, January, February, March, or whenever. So they have to carry the weight of that student's cost for a long time. But thank you. That's a good point. Thank you.
Representative Johnson.
Just real quick, is the reverse true if students leave after they've been counted, then that's just benefits the district a little bit?
Correct. Right.
So there's no effort to try to
grab it
balance
back.
that on a
There's no clawback.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So home hospital students, and again, this is not a huge number, a huge factor of SEEK, just another add-on for those students who are, medically unable to come to school. School districts typically, send a teacher to their home in a normal year, of course, and the district does generate some funding for this program. 2006 or so, limited English students were added, and this is a number that goes up in population, but not dramatically so. It's a relatively small part of SEEK, but you'll see pockets in Warren County, Shelby, Woodford, et cetera, where you would probably expect larger populations, but just about every district has a handful of limited English students. Again, it's not a huge factor in the total of SEEK or anything like that.
And for those LEP students, we have heard some feedback from districts because, like with our special education population, there are varying degrees of when you receive an LEP student and what that means. So for some LEP students, you literally have a child that comes in that does not speak any English at all. And then you've got some that might have English spoken in their household. So we have heard some conversations about districts about, is that something that's right for us to think about in a little different manner?
So again, Nichols, these are just additional taxes, and I'll give you a few examples. Several sessions ago, there was a nickel that the General Assembly passed, and we called it the Category 5, and this was to go after a list of the worst school buildings we had in the state. And this nickel, the General Assembly said, hey, these districts can levy this, address this issue, get these buildings fixed. And they were. Simple as that. The state helped, add some additional money to that bucket so these districts could take care of these buildings that were ranked in like the worst order. And there were some others historically. We'll get into a few of these, but basically the district, as they collect their taxes, they're going to restrict a portion of that for the building fund. And much like we do with our paychecks and our mortgage, we don't just go out and blow it on stuff. We have to kind of restrict that to make sure we pay our mortgage. It's just the rules of the road. So the districts, in some cases, facilities is interesting. Some districts, it seems to be perpetually doing construction. Others are doing a lot of renovation. Independents may not ever be able to build new. They may just renovate. And that's fine, but they've got to pay for that, obviously. So this is the mechanism in which we have to pay for facilities. And there's a local component, and there's also the state component for some districts. Not all districts qualify for that. It's based on that per pupil assessment. And I'm going to show you all a little trick here in a minute. And you could easily see on a scale how much districts would really get from equalized money for their facilities. And this tax, this nickel, only applies to real estate and tangible property, not to motor vehicles. So this is a very, very short history of the nickels as they exist today. There's the Facility Support Program of Kentucky. That's the original. That's one everybody has to have. That's your minimum. And then probably late 90s to early 2000s, had a lot of districts growing very fast. And I'm going to pick on Oldham County. They grew. So to catch their facilities up with this growth, General Assembly started doing these growth nickels for districts that met certain criteria. They could levy an additional nickel. And I'm going to skip the recallable because that's a little bit different conversation. The Equalized Facility Funding Nickel, and we call it the EFF, It's just another nickel. These have names, but if it's directed toward a certain thing, like Category 5 or the next one, the base realignment, that was for Fort Knox in Hardin County, very specific. So you can direct it, or you can just say it's open for everybody. So when they direct it like that, Hardin County, that allowed them to levy an additional nickel, which I believe at the time was to address some issues with a large influx of Fort Knox folks or a large decrease in Fort Knox folks, and kind of redoing their district, if you will. So things like that. And if, for example, we know if there's another Toyota plant coming to deep West Kentucky, to Ballard County or Fulton County, the General Assembly may say, hey, you're going to need some facilities, and this is a way we can do it. So it's just that mechanism of funding these facilities. Now, if you go back in about the middle, the recallable nickel is the only currently available nickel for districts. It's the only one that's legislatively active in the sense that they can adopt it. And off the top of my head, I can't remember how many districts have adopted this. Some have actually adopted 2 in order to meet their facility needs. Not very many have done that, gone down that road, but the process is, again, it's subject to a public petition, which can challenge it and then eventually force a public vote if enough signatures are collected. So it's got that community buy-in, if you will. And some districts, and I'm sure the superintendents can speak to this somewhat, and over time I've worked on a lot of these for many districts. In some communities, it's like they're not doing anything, and everybody's like, that's fine. We're okay with this. And others, it can get a little more contentious, or it's just not time for it, if you will. So this is just part of the process. That public buy-in is very important. And, if it does force a vote, and I couldn't tell you the record, but I know Henderson was successful in their vote. Some districts have not been. So it's kind of a mixed bag with mixed results. But it's a very important part of that process is how we fund facilities.
Chuck.
Jay, because nickels aren't complicated enough, can you explain nickel equivalent versus just a nickel?
Yeah, that one's pretty easy. So when we call it a nickel, we throw that term around a lot. But when you look at your tax bill and say it's, 63.6 cents, the districts, in order to generate 5 cents worth of local taxes, will sometimes have to, levy 5.6 cents because of collections. So there's always a gap in collections. Some districts, they might have a couple of great years and some are very consistent. But if your local economics start to go south in a hurry, and we saw this in a couple districts a couple of years ago where, coal bottomed out, those districts really, really had a hard time collecting taxes, but importantly, people that lived there couldn't pay them. No income, no property taxes. That's just the economics of it. So those districts would had to actually collect, say, 6.3 cents to generate 5 cents of taxes. Whereas someone who has strong collections, and I'll pick on Scott County, probably 99% collections, if not that, they would probably do a 5.2 cent nickel in order to generate 5 cents. So Tier 1 allows school boards, and I think we're now at 100% of our districts actually levy taxes at this rate, although I believe it's 6 don't get equalized because of their property wealth, and that's that $916,000. So when you look at that per pupil property assessment, if your district that you're looking at is over $916,000, they will not get equalized on their facilities funding. They will not get Tier 1 funding. If they're at $200,000, they'll get a lot more than someone at $400,000 or $600,000 or $800,000. So the closer that per pupil property assessment gets to 916, it sort of draws it down. And once you cross that, it goes to zero. Now, that 916,000 is part of a formula that we update every 2 years during budget. So it's just part of the budget process that kind of moves up with the property assessment. It's kind of a moving target, if you will. Mm-hmm. And off the top of my head, the 6 that don't qualify, and I'm going to forget something, Livingston, Lyon, Campbell, Fayette, and Jefferson, and Anchorage. It's kind of an odd group, but yes, sorry. Fayette, Jefferson, Anchorage, Campbell, I may have missed Campbell in the first round, Livingston, and Lyon. So it's a little bit of an odd mix, but Livingston and Lyon's property assessments and their student population, they're actually what we call hold harmless districts, they and Anchorage. And what that hold harmless says is that if your per pupil that you generate is less than it was in 1991-92, I believe, it actually, the state throws some additional money in that pot for them, because Anchorage's, their property assessment is by far the highest in the state. And Livingston and Lyons, just their per pupil assessment, it's, pretty high. So that gives them a little bit of state money. And I believe Senator Mills may have introduced a bill last session or two to address that issue for Livingston and Lyon County. So again, Tier 1 is just an additional pot of money. So they take 15% of their revenue. It's adjusted through SEEK-based funding. And if you go back and talk to your superintendents and board members that are deep into the budget talks, for most districts, this is a nice chunk of money of their budget from the state anyway. So it's a very important source of funding for them. So when we talk about SEEK, probably I would say in the next couple of months, we'll start talking to the state economist about trying to map out an estimate where we think SEEK's going to be in the next 2-year cycle. And we work with LRC staff, previously Chuck, now Seth, and we worked with Seth in the past, Seth Dawson, sorry. And we'll work with them to sort of communicate, this is where we think SEEK dollar-wise will be and the student populations. And then during the budget process, the LRC, the General Assembly rather, will work to, come up with that per pupil amount and, what big buckets of money, and it's big, will go into each line item. So what happens after that budget is passed, if we've correctly, created these estimates, we'll have enough money to pay all the districts and everybody's happy. But what happens if we're wrong? If we just undershot, or now we have, instead of 16,000 limited English students, I've got 25,000. They came in from wherever they came in from. So that creates a SEEK shortfall. So the shortfalls are awful for my office because we get to communicate to most of the superintendents on, you're not getting what we told you were going to get. And as you can imagine, I'm not very popular when that happens. We've got, knock on wood, pretty good track record of keeping our head above water. But to give you some idea of how close we cut it, on roughly $2 billion, I think last year I was within 0.5%. So that's because LRC staff and GOPM or OSBD staff work together to try to talk through any issues we've got with our estimates. If we have concerns about, this exceptional child count's growing a lot faster than we expected, we work together to figure out what's a good number for everybody. We understand there's limitations to the budget. It's competing interest, if you will. Education's important to me, but you also have corrections and Medicaid and all these other things that go on. So as we get through this budget process, we say small prayers at night about making sure we have enough. We don't want to take too much off the table because that's money that can't be effectively used elsewhere. So that's a really, really important part of my job. And if you ever hear your superintendent say, we have a shortfall, and it's probably, you'll hear me screaming about it somewhere. So this is the one part of my job that keeps me up at night a lot, thinking about if we're short. Now, the excess is easy. I've got some additional money, and usually there's language in that budget bill that tells us where to direct it. If there is an excess, you can send it to the transportation funding formula, or it goes to currently the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. So depending on how the General Assembly writes that language, it can go to a million places. So that's if we have excess. So as you're staying awake at night and thinking of SEEK, as I know you will, and you think, I have a question or I want to read some stuff, there are some really good documents out there. The budget bill is actually a good place to start to understand, I think, the level of funding that SEEK gets and to understand the enormity of it. And also our webpage, or web pages rather, with, you can go look at your home districts pretty easily. You can go look at Jefferson and Fayette. How do they compare? Jefferson, Fayette, and Campbell. What's Jefferson look like when you get down into the smaller numbers versus Dayton Independent? It's a good way to kind of give you some context about independents and county districts. So I'm sure my two superintendents to my right will tell you they operate a little differently. And also, to give some credit behind me, I think they're still in the room, the Office of Education Accountability has done studies over the years. There's one, it's a little aged now, it's in the mid 2000s, but it's a good preview of a lot of things, a lot of history, but also, how things have changed over time. I want to say it's mid 2000s when that came out, but that's a great resource to kind of read through about why things are the way they are. So
I can't think of any better beach reading or vacation reading than those.
I agree.
Those links that you provided. So if anybody's got any upcoming trips to Destin, Paul Mullins, I think Representative Bojanowski just got back from the Outer Banks, but man, that would have been great on the water. I can't thank you all enough. You did exactly what we asked you. You went above and beyond. Shay, thank you for your insight.
Appreciate it.
Robin, thank you also. OEA, wonderful as always with what you provide. For our first meeting and to really get into this, you educated me. If you can do that, that is a very good job because this is very in-depth. So we do have a number of comments or questions. I'm going to get to those real quickly. Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Shay, I want to ask you, going back to slide number 14, where you did the examples of the two students in different districts.
yes, sir.
So literally, if I look at this, there are districts that are getting $3,000 virtually less per student than some other districts. Is that possible?
I think it's possible. And one other resource you can look at is the school report card on our website. And you can even obviously look at your own, but it will break it down a little differently. I think to me, a little more readable format that you could see and when we talk about per pupil spending, that's a bit of a loaded question because you have to consider a lot of it's the way they would calculate it is through averages, because not every penny, they account for at every single school. So it makes it a little tricky to say, in Franklin County, I'll pick on them. If we spend $2 million on transportation a year, how much does Collins Lane Elementary use of that? And how much does Hearn Elementary use of that? So they may just say, well, we'll divide it by the number of schools, and that gives you a rough ballpark. But I think that's a good resource to understand. And when you see that, one thing to keep in mind is historically, some districts have a very aggressive tax policy, and they will raise local taxes in order to do what they need to do. And not to pick on independents, but typically we have some that are well over $100 cents per $100. So when you're looking at a tax bill, I may pay half in Franklin County what I would pay in an independent district along the northern Kentucky border or Ohio border. It's just the size of the district. It's the makeup of that property. If it's mostly residential, a PVA might only reassess that one little area every 4 years, and it just doesn't grow as much as, say, Scott County with all the factories and development that they have going on there. So it is, like Robin said, a tale of two districts. But it is very feasible that you could have a district with very aggressive tax policy that they will bring in quite a bit more than some other districts.
And all of those local taxes go directly to the district. They don't go through KDE.
Correct. I never see a dime of that, right?
Right. One last one.
Please proceed.
Is this year, I know because of COVID and things, there was a lot of CARES money that went to our districts. Did any of that come through KDE? Or did it go through directly to districts?
Yeah, so with the various funding that's come in response to the coronavirus pandemic, the funds have come through KDE. We've had 3 rounds of the elementary and secondary school emergency fund that have come through us. So, and then we appropriate that down to our local school districts. At least 90% of that has to go out to grants to our local school districts. And that 10% that is reserved at the state level, we use for statewide efforts, again, to support our local school districts. In one round, we actually made some of that state set aside directly available to our districts. And so that's moving forward. And then, of course, there's GEAR funding. There's a lot of federal funds that are actually coming to our districts right now. Those funds will last until through stages, but the latest date is through September of 2024. And then those will expire.
Would you know the total amount that has been given or that has come through in those rounds altogether?
I actually did myself a little cheat sheet thinking that you might ask that question. So from ESSER 1, which was the CARES appropriation, it was $193 million that came to Kentucky.
Okay.
So that's 90% of that would have gone to our local school districts. From ESSER 2, which was under CRISA, $928 million. And of that, 90% would typically go to our districts, but then we allowed another about 38 million that has gone to our districts from the state set aside. For ARP ESSER, which is our most recent round, the Commonwealth of Kentucky received about $2 billion in ARP ESSER. In Gear 1 and Gear 2, which were both allocations to the governor's office and under the governor's discretion on how to distribute those, the public local school districts got 30 million of that. And then in Gear 2, those amounts were appropriated elsewhere, so that local school districts did not get anything out of that. However, some of that appropriation went to Friskies. And so it didn't go directly to our school districts, but it will benefit our local school districts from the Friskies program. And then we also received about $8 million from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was again administered by the governor's office. And that was to help us with some broadband connectivity initiatives in our local school districts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chairman Tipton.
Thank you, Chair Wise. A quick follow-up to that. On the latest round, the AARP money, where are we on clarification from the federal government on how those funds can be dispersed?
On clarification?
Or on the rules and regulations?
Yeah, so on June 1st, the U.S. Department of Education actually produced a pretty good FAQ document that is helping us to answer a lot of the questions that our local districts have. Generally speaking, ARP ESSER funds can be used similar to the first two rounds of ESSER funding. However, for our local school districts, they have to reserve 20% of those funds to really address those learning loss type issues for our students. And then there's also some reservations at the state level on how those state dollars can be expended. The most challenging piece, I think, that we still have at the Department of Education and still trying to get a lot of direction on is the use of funds for school facility renovations or new construction. There's just a lot of rules, federal rules, about the use of monies for school, really any kind of construction. You know, you're subject to Davis-Bacon, and there's lots of additional reporting and that type of thing. So that's the most, I think, the still most confusing piece of the ARP ESSER funds and how you can utilize those really to their fullest potential.
Mr. Chairman, Robin brought up something that brought up another question. General Assembly appropriated $127 million for facility construction. And I know the governor just recently, I believe, released the amounts, the awards on that. And is there any dispute yet on whether or not we can use the CARES money for that? Because that was to come from the CARES money, as I understood it.
Yeah, so that money is coming from the coronavirus. It's actually coming from the Capital Construction Fund. Okay. So it's this other pot of money that's governed by U.S. Treasury. Okay. It's not even coming through the U.S. Department of Education. Okay. So I think the governor's office is still looking at it. The appropriation came from the General Assembly for the use of those funds. They've asked for a little bit of additional information on that related to how our buildings are wired and are connected from a broadband perspective. But we're just trying to work through that and provide additional information to U.S. Treasury.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, real quickly, I do have a question on the presentation.
Please proceed.
We've talked about SEEK funding today. There's another large pot of money out there that goes to our school districts in direct appropriations. My question is, just for clarification, a significant portion of what the state spends every year is for the employer match for teacher retirement system. Does that flow through SEEK? Or does that flow through another line?
It does not flow through SEEK. It is a separate line item.
It's a separate line item. Okay.
Right.
So the SEEK, you've got the SEEK dollars, and the it's a very large sum of money. It flows through a different appropriation than SEEK. Correct? I wanted clarification on that.
Yeah. So SEEK is its own. The Department of Education actually has 3 large appropriations, and SEEK is one of those appropriations. Additional dollars do flow through to districts or are paid on their behalf, which is how we do retirement, are paid on their behalf from the other appropriation levels.
Representative Bojanowski.
Yes, so my question is, so going back to 1990 and CARA and the Rose decision, how did they set the original SEEK amount? Was it based on like a study of the cost to provide an adequate education for all students? How did they come up? Because we have, in all our iterations, we go based on that number, but how did that number originally get set?
That's a great question. I don't really know. I don't have a historical context of how they actually started, what was the per pupil amount. And I do know, like, the add-ons, because we've asked that same question, why is a severe exceptional child 2.35? And I think if you look back in time, this is my assumption, that the factors themselves were set based on, prevailing wisdom at the time. This is roughly what it would cost to educate, or at least some of that cost. Now, I can't say that for certain because there's no, I guess, history at the department. I think I've been there over 10 years, but obviously going back to 89, 90, 91.
That can help.
Chuck. Let's put Chuck on the spot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, this was one of a comment that I was going to make. Anyway, when CARA originally passed, I can't speak to the SEEK per pupil amount, but the weights. Originally, CARA directed a study to be done to determine what those weights for those add-ons should be. And I believe Stanford University got that contract. I think the education committee staff has it sitting in a folder somewhere, and I think I've got it electronically somewhere. But they were the ones that set those weights based on the relative cost to educate students at the time. Now, that was obviously more than 30 years ago. So the relative costs may have changed and maybe changed significantly over those last 30 years. But I'll see if I can't dig that up.
Thanks, Chuck. Do you want anything else that you had from earlier?
Well, the only other comment I was going to make is to Che's point earlier, where they work very closely, particularly with the Office of the State Budget Director for their projections, and we base all of our budget numbers on those projections. And so I think it's pretty fantastic that they get that close, given all the factors that weigh into that. And I would say that between the property assessment increases that are coming for some districts, and I would also point out that those projections are not on a statewide basis. They go by district, student cohort by student cohort to do projections. So it's not like you're just increasing property assessments by 2% statewide. They do it on a district by district level. So that's going to put an extra burden on them this coming budget cycle. On top of which, I would note, House Bill 563 will allow students to transfer to non-resident districts on a much wider scale than they've done in the past. So I would plead with the committee and those who are involved in the budget process to extend a great amount of grace to Robin and Che and their staffs and the OSBD staff when they're trying to come up with projections for next year.
Excellent point, Chuck. Thank you. And Representative Bojanowski, I'm sure we can get with Josh and staff to maybe provide you any historical documents we have. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't going to ask this question earlier because I didn't want to disrupt the flow of your presentation, but since we're doing questions, if we could go way back to slide number 5, where it talks about requirements to qualify for SEEK. One of the qualifications was compensating teachers on the basis of a single salary schedule. What does that mean?
So, and these are available. You'll see if every district publishes their salary schedule for teachers, for example. And I don't know if we have any former teachers in the room, but essentially as you gain experience, there we go. Current teachers can tell you that it's a scale as you sort of, I think, get your master's and you kind of move up and progress. And then you get years of experience factors in there too. And it will vary by district. So, and I'll pick on Jefferson a little bit because of, the cost of living in Jefferson County is very different than, say, I don't know, Graves County. Their schedules are different as far as if I'm a first-year teacher, second-year teacher, and so on. And I don't believe that it will translate from district to district. I believe once you go, if I went to Anderson, then to Spencer, then to Boyle, you're going to be on a completely different salary schedule in each of those districts. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Superintendent Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. Just to follow up to Chairman Tipton's comment earlier, a couple things. First of all, Che and Robin do a phenomenal job working with our districts, and their phones are always open to us. So I'd like to just say for just a second that they do a phenomenal job. We really appreciate the work they do as a superintendent. Second of all, on the 127 million, I'd like for a clarification for this group maybe everyone here realizes, but some districts were not eligible for that. And the reason for that, from my understanding, and Che and Robin, if correct me if I'm wrong, they have to have the recallable nickel. If you don't have that recallable nickel, you weren't eligible for the 127 million. It doesn't matter what your buildings look like. You could have the lowest ranked building in the state. If you didn't have the recallable nickel, you weren't eligible for any of that 127 million funding. Am I correct in that?
Correct.
Yeah, that's correct. The appropriation of the 127 million, of course, was to the School Facilities Construction Commission, and some of the eligibility requirements were crafted by that commission in accordance with kind of their standard and customary practices, as I understand it. So you're right, Superintendent Fletcher.
Thank you. And then the other thing too is there's a lot of information out there. You can find, and I'll be happy to supply that. You may be able to find online, but if you want to look at the disparities of teacher salaries across our state, we actually had talked with some people here, but you'd be amazed by the disparity, how much difference there is in salary schedules. But basically, essentially, every year you go on, you're going to get a little bit of a raise, and it depends if you're in Lawrence County versus Fayette County. And again, a lot of that goes back to cost of living. Cost of living in Jefferson County is going to be much higher than Lawrence County, so that makes sense. But again, there are varying levels of salary schedules for teachers across our state.
Very good points. Representative Banta.
I'm just trying to figure out if I'm thinking clearly. 30 years ago, we set a number for SEEK, and we haven't adjusted up with inflation or anything. Does that seem odd to anybody else?
Well, the per pupil amount has increased. So, and there's some history of that. And somewhere deep in my emails, I've got a history of where it started. And I believe I probably borrowed that from the Office of Education Accountability. But it shows you, we were down in the 2000s per pupil, for example. I can't remember where we started. And over time, it's increased. I think we've had a couple years where it stayed flat, relatively flat. And then some other years, I'm sure when money was very flush, the General Assembly increased it quite a bit. I'll be glad to supply that. I think that's important to see for context. The thing that's probably not changed very much are the factors. So if you're a speech student, for example, the factor that we generate, and that's something that we at the department have talked about quite a bit over the years, is like, why is this at this factor? What's that factor really mean? Has that changed over time? It's just not something that we've been able to approach and say, well, this is something we really want to change with the General Assembly, because obviously if you increase a factor, that usually increases cost as well. But I think that's a good conversation to have to understand, are these factors still applicable? Does it still cost X amount to teach these types of students? Or free lunch students, 15%. Is 15% still good, bad, indifferent? What is that? So that's a very good question.
Very good.
Senator Wise?
Yes.
May I make one comment on behalf of the department? So we really appreciate the opportunity to just come and talk to you about SEEK and what it looks like right now. But I feel like I would be falling short if I didn't put a plug in for the needs of the department to have a system that whatever SEEK looks like, we need improvements to our current system and funding to go along with that. So we've had kind of an in-house built system. It takes the calculations from other places and we dump it into the SEEK system. We have staff that care for that system tenderly, but it has its shortcomings. So when we talk about making changes to SEEK, it will be impossible for us to do that through our current SEEK system. We will either have to have a brand new system. It does not allow us to, when we get a call that says, if we change something about SEEK, can you tell us what that's going to do? It doesn't automatically do that. So anything that is considered and changes to SEEK, or if we leave it the same even, we really need funding to help us with that system so that Che and I, that's another thing that we lose sleep at overnight, that at someday the SEEK system's just not going to work. So I felt like with this opportunity, I wanted to put that on the table for you all to think about as well.
Duly noted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much, Robin. Any other questions, any other comments for our presenters? Anybody online? Any comments from anyone? All right. Seeing none, once again, thank you so much for the excellent presentation today. Last thing on the agenda is basically just an open discussion on task force objectives. Everyone should have in their folder it's presented, and if you're online, it says here School Funding Task Force HB 405, and it's basically the directives that were sent to us in turn. I'm not going to go over each one of these, but basically what the School Funding Task Force is charged to do. And a lot of this is reviewing, but also at the end maybe developing, submitting any recommendations, any possible changes. And with that, I think just the roadmap ahead, for this funding task force to look at. We had a lot of good information today. It's a lot of things we probably can even nail down even farther if we want to get into transportation, want to get into taxes, we want to get into a whole host of things that was presented today. We can do so, and I'm not going to put everyone on the spot to say, here's our recommendations for today. I know sometimes we leave a meeting, we can think back to some things, and that's why we have emails. We can contact Josh. You can reach out to me, reach out to Co-Chair Tipton with that. But I'm open right now for any discussion on some things we heard today, some things maybe we can look forward to going forward as we proceed. Senator Thomas.
Yeah, Max, let me be my typical self and say probably my biggest takeaway from the day, and I really want to think this through. Probably has nothing to do with the SEEK formula itself, but I'm really inquisitive as to why the findings that were reported by Che today was that our number of students is actually decreasing over the years, but our number of exceptional students has increased. Now that is something I really want to explore more deeply. What's going on there? Why is that occurring? That's something that I really got to work through. But I think we ought to at least explore that a little deeper.
Thanks, Senator Thomas. Josh is taking some notes up here as discussions are taking place. Anyone else? Any other discussions from anything today? Anything on a roadmap forward as we go ahead? Representative Banta.
Yes, I think that we need to, as we're looking at funding, we also need to look at unfunded mandates that have come down on schools and things and underfunded things that have been brought down schools.
Thank you so much. And as I mentioned, we don't have to mention everything as today. We can go forward and communicate by email. Anyone out there online wishing to contribute anything to the discussion for anything today as we go forward? Seeing none, closing comments. Our next meeting will be taking place, and all of our meetings tentatively are scheduled for Monday mornings at 10 a.m. monthly. Our next one is scheduled for Monday, July 19th. That will be at 10 a.m. Co-Chair Tipton, I'll close with you. Since the next month will be your meeting, if anything you wish to talk about from today's meeting or as we proceed forward, sir.
Well, I think today was a good opportunity for us just to see how the funding formula works, a general idea of it. And hopefully, as we go home, we'll have questions. We can encourage you to talk to your superintendent, school board members back home, and we look forward for input. And I'm really glad to see the superintendents and the school board members be a part of it. I really look forward to your input. So it's important for us to understand your perspective at the local level, because it doesn't always equate to us in Frankfort. So it's good to have you here, and this is an important conversation. Critical conversation, and look forward to everybody being here and participating next month.
Could not agree more. Thank you to all of our legislators present. Thank you to our superintendents and our school board members for contributing today. Once again, those meeting times could change. I know summer times can be busy for everyone. If you do know you have complications with future meetings, please let Josh or Chris know. Is there a motion for adjournment? So moved. Thank you all.